morning, Mr. Fitzpatrick. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your name for the court reporter?
My name is Ryan Fitzpatrick, RyanFitzpatrick.
And what do you do for a living?
I run a medical facility in Hypoluxo, Florida.
Do you know someone by the name of Charles Adelson?
Yes, ma'am.
How do you know him?
Known Charlie for many years. He was a former friend of mine and a former business partner of mine.
And how long ago do you think, and you can approximate, how long have you known him? 2012, 11?
Like 15 years.
Okay. And when do you, if you remember, when did you first meet?
Prior to moving to South Florida, just through mutual friends.
And from that time on, you guys were really close, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you know his family as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you spent a considerable amount of time with his family?
Yes, ma'am, I have.
So you know his mother, Donna?
Yes, ma'am.
Harvey?
Yes, ma'am.
And his sister, Wendy?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know his brother, Robert?
No, ma'am, I do not.
Have you ever met him?
No, ma'am.
When you were ever around the Adelson family, did they talk about him a lot?
No, ma'am.
And how close would you describe Charles Adelson to his mother, Donna?
Very close.
Like, talk on the phone every day?
Yes, ma'am.
Multiple times a day?
Probably, yes, ma'am.
And how close was he to his sister, Wendy?
I mean, very close.
Was he protective of her?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever meet Wendy?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember how many times you were hanging out around her?
Multiple occasions.
Okay, but the majority of the time that you knew her, was she living in Tallahassee?
Yes, ma'am. Well, no, she had come to South Florida at that point for the majority of the time, but I had know who she was and when she was in Tallahassee.
Okay, so the majority of the time that you spent with her is after she relocated back to Miami after the death of her ex-husband?
Yes, ma'am.
After the murder of her ex-husband?
Yes, ma'am.
Did she ever talk to you about her divorce?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did Charlie ever talk to you about her divorce?
Maybe occasionally in passing, nothing that I recollect of significance at all.
Was there a type of tone or demeanor to him whenever he was referencing the divorce or Dan Markel?
After the murder, yes.
Okay. Before the murder,
No, ma'am.
Okay.
No.
After the murder, how did Charles express his feelings towards Dan Markel? Did he, one way or the other? If he didn't, he didn't. If he did, he did. Let us know.
Can you rephrase it?
Let me make it easy. Did he ever talk badly about Dan Markel?
Nobody talked good about Dan.
Nobody talked to you about Dan?
Not in that family.
Okay.
Nobody talked good about Dan, I said.
Okay, so that's what I was going to get to. How did you, because you've been around them, how did you get there? What was their feeling towards Dan Markel?
I mean, I really didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Obviously, it was insignificant to me at the time, but, you know, I mean, you could tell it wasn't someone that they were fond of.
Now, how would you would you describe Charlie Adelson as the marrying kind? Want to settle
He was
down
never my type, no.
Okay. I appreciate that, Mr. Fitzpatrick. All right. So, but Charlie wasn't a one-woman kind of girl, was he? When you guys were
No,
friends?
ma'am.
Okay, and you kind of laughed when you said that.
Yes, ma'am.
He would have different girls all the time.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you even keep track of them?
No, ma'am.
Would some of these girls, the ones you've seen, they overlap with each other, right?
I imagine they did, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And as far as you knew, all these women didn't know about each other, if you know.
I don't think so, no, ma'am.
Okay. And you remember when he started dating Catherine, right?
Vaguely, yes, ma'am. Just
Okay.
because I would hear her name, Katie, Cat, you know.
That's how Charles would refer to her?
Yes, ma'am.
And your understanding of their relationship, was this just one of the girls that Charles was seeing?
To be honest, I really didn't pay a lot of attention to girls that he saw.
Understandably.
It was just kind of like, okay, whatever.
Just because it's another one and another one and another one.
ma'am.
You don't want to invest too much time in someone you're probably not going to know for too long.
No, ma'am.
All right. Now, Would you describe Charlie as being someone who likes to be the center of attention?
I guess you could describe him as that, yes, ma'am.
Can you describe for the jury as a friend how much he talks?
When doesn't he talk?
I couldn't have said it better.
Right.
So, and isn't it true that part of the reason you don't speak to him is because you got sick of listening to him talk?
It became overwhelming, yes, ma'am.
And it's because he always puts himself as the center. It's always him, his problems just going on in his life, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And is it an accurate description to say that he will repeat the same thing 100 different times, 100 different ways to prove his point?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And has he ever, when he's trying to prove a point to you, presented different scenarios to try to prove his point?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And sometimes do you just agree with him because you give up?
Yes, ma'am.
You just want him to shut up, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Now, have you seen him use this technique to manipulate others?
To myself, I mean, I've experienced it, and
Do you feel that that's what he tries to do with his words, is that he's a manipulator?
I mean, I never thought of it as like that till later in our relationship, but you can say that, yes.
Okay. And you'd also describe him as being very, very smart, right?
Brilliant, yes.
Brilliant is the word you've used. Can he read a situation very quickly and just react?
Yes, ma'am.
The wheels are always turning when it comes to him, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, were you best friends with him in July of 2014?
We were close friends.
Okay, I'll say close friends.
We got closer as time went on.
Okay, and then you had said earlier, just so we have a time frame for the jury, that you eventually have a falling out.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember what year that was?
I mean, the COVID year that I imagine it was 2018.
Okay, perfect.
June of 2018 or something around that time.
All right, and I know it's an approximation, but the year is held.
Yes, ma'am.
So going back to around the time that Dan Markel was murdered, because that is July 2014, and you said you guys were close friends, right? There's a bunch of you guys, right, that hung out.
Yes, ma'am.
Who was a group, basically? You, there's Clint Stevenson, right?
Yes, ma'am.
There's Darren Pike.
Yes, ma'am.
There's, am I leaving anyone? Charles?
Yes, ma'am.
Anyone else that is a close friend of that group?
I mean, there was a large group
Okay.
of friends. Yes, ma'am.
Of guys, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And whenever you guys, I mean, when this happened, that was a pretty big deal, right?
Yes.
Someone that he knew, a family member, former family member, had been murdered.
Yes, ma'am.
That just doesn't happen every day, right?
Not my family.
Now, when he was around you guys, did he ever say anything like, oh my God, you would not believe what happened to Wendy's husband?
Never.
Never said, did you guys hear this about Dan Markel?
No, ma'am.
You never heard him express that, right?
No, ma'am.
Did he, as far as you know, go up to Tallahassee to be with his sister when he was murdered?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do you know if he's ever been to Tallahassee?
No, ma'am.
Did you find that strange that he just never spoke about the circumstances surrounding Wendy's ex-husband's murder?
I think it was so hard to fathom and that it was a reality, I guess, that
Okay.
I really didn't, it was just never brought up, so it was almost like it wasn't real,
Okay.
even though obviously it is.
And that's close to home as it relates to Charles Adelson. This is his sister's ex-husband.
Yes, ma'am.
The father of her two sons, his nephews. Right?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Have you ever met them?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, isn't it true that when you were friends with Charlie, one of the ways that you would use to communicate with him, and he communicated with you, is by the use of WhatsApp?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
Okay, now, and he would use the WhatsApp to make phone calls to you on the phone. That's how you guys would talk, voice calls on WhatsApp, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you knew that back then, I mean, Charlie even would talk to you a couple times a day, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And so your records had WhatsApp. You don't know if WhatsApp would be reflected on call detail records, right?
Well, the thought was that it was encrypted communication.
Mm-hmm. Would you describe Charles Adelson as a paranoid person in that way?
Yes, ma'am.
Like, has all these cameras around his house?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and always thinking that, like, you know, always very cautious when he's talking on the phone.
Yes, ma'am.
And this was even before Dan Markel was murdered, right?
I can't recall. I don't even think WhatsApp was out back then, but I mean.
It was, but
yeah.
But you don't. That's just the nature of who he was, kind of. That he's always kind of suspicious of everyone.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Now you remember meeting Catherine, and
in passing, but no, I don't know Catherine personally at all.
no, and the one time you had met, you had seen her at his house.
I believe so. Yes, ma'am. I mean, it's been so long.
You do remember, though, Charles telling you that Sigfredo Garcia, the mother of her kids, had confronted him before, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You also remember him telling you something about a confrontation that involved Katie.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember?
Just continue with your question.
Okay, I'll just go to the next one where you just asked it, Judge. Okay. Now, with that said, do you know if Charles knew about the existence of Sigfredo Garcia?
Yes, ma'am.
Has Charles Adelson ever made payments to you in cash?
Yes, ma'am.
How did he package his money?
Stapled.
Describe for the jury how bills and where the staple would be.
Usually would separate $1,000 at a time. 10 100s equals $1,000, and would staple that.
Okay, and you just staple like stacks of hundreds, but it's 10 $100 bills.
Yes, ma'am.
Per 1,000, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And he's paid you that way before.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you find that strange?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yes, ma'am.
And I mean, if that was an odd way to have money, you've never seen anyone ever done that with money before, right?
No, ma'am.
Now, in your estimation, 10 stacks of the thousands, it'd be the same as if it were 10 $1 bills, right? Because a $1 bill and a $100 bill are the same in diameter, width, and all of that, right?
Correct.
So if you just stack 10 of them together, it's pretty thin, right?
Correct.
And then you put 10 of those together, it's probably about that big, right?
Probably, yes, ma'am.
Not like a brick of cocaine.
Right.
Now, to your knowledge, did Charlie use drugs? Like, have you ever seen him do drugs in front of you? Marijuana?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you know if he was using steroids? Only if you know.
I know he was.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, around the time that Catherine was arrested, all right, that was in October of 2016, did you notice a change in his behavior?
Yes, ma'am.
Describe for the jury what that change was.
Frantic behavior, nervousness, paranoia, restlessness.
Did you guys as a group ever even confront or just ask him, or this was just a topic that was off limits when it came to Dan Markel and how he died?
Did we confront him as...
Like, you know, just in passing or talking, because this was kind of a known thing. Did you ever say, hey, did your family ever get any information about what happened to Dan Markel?
It was never really relating to Dan. It was just relating to the case.
Okay. And would he ever talk about the case with you guys, or just not?
Just that, you know, he was innocent. He's got nothing to worry about. This is nonsense, or other expletive terms about it.
Okay. Do you remember him ever saying something in reference to, you know, you can get away with murder, you just have to keep your mouth shut?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. He's not one to keep his mouth shut, is he?
No, ma'am.
Now, around the time that, oh no, I asked you that already. Now, at some point, you said you had a falling out with Charles Adelson, right?
Correct.
Has he, since the time of 2016, has all of his close male friendships kind of fallen apart?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, is he still friends with Darren Pike? As far as if you know,
I think they still communicate, and, well, not anymore, but I think they were still in communication. I don't necessarily know at whose benefit that was.
Okay. But Clint Stevenson and some of the others, not close
I don't believe
anymore.
they speak to him anymore as well.
Now, with regards to you, what happened that caused your falling out?
Well, it was kind of a labored relationship, just because all he did was complain, talk about himself, talk about this scenario as well. And it just got old. I mean, it would be 4 times a day, repetitive, calling me at noon in the middle of the day, 45-minute phone calls in the middle of the day. And it just got frustrating. And then we had a business together, whereas we had a difference of opinions on how it should go. And because of this trial at hand, or potential trial at hand, he kind of freaked out and pulled the rug out from under me. And I continued to placate the friendship in order to close out our books and do the right thing. And, you know, he kind of crossed me a little bit and then has since opened up, you know, litigation against me. So.
Against you, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And now, even though you've been friends with him for years, you did not hear from the police until after the pandemic, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So your name is all over his iCloud, but they didn't contact you until 2020.
Correct.
And this was after he had begun his lawsuit against you.
Yes.
So they probably
Yes,
knew,
ma'am.
they probably knew you weren't on good terms.
Correct.
And it was a phone call that they reached out to you, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember who it was that you spoke to on the phone?
Mr. Newland and someone from the FBI.
Agent Sanford, sound familiar? Could be.
I don't know.
Okay.
He's special agent.
Special agent, all right. And you told them specifically about the money, right? How
'Cause
you've
they
seen
had-
him packaged it that way before.
They asked me about the money, and I concurred with their
Oh, so
question.
they specifically asked you about that.
It kind of led into it, and then yeah, because I figured they already knew the answer, so tell
And
them the
then-
truth.
When they called you, they specifically directed your attention to, hey, we know you're friends with Charlie. Do you have any information about the murder of Dan Markel? Is that
Basically, yes, ma'am.
okay? And you told them more or less everything that you've told this jury today, right?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And that's a lot of relevant information that you have against Charlie, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
You're not here under a state subpoena, are you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Which side brought you here to testify in court?
Catherine's side.
All right. And I want to talk to you about one other thing. You know about had a Lexus
Yes,
at
ma'am.
some point in time, right?
Harvey's.
It was Harvey's Lexus, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then it ends up, well, the records show that Catherine paid for it, okay? Have you ever bought a car from Charles Adelson, or do you guys have?
He bought one from a friend that I sold a Range Rover to a friend that sold it to Charlie, and then Charlie since sold it.
But that's something that he's done, is he'll buy cars and then he sells them. It was at a reduced rate too for this Range Rover, right? Very. How much was it sold for?
I think it was bought for me for 17. I think I sold it 8,500 or something like that.
Okay, and Range Rover's a pretty high price car. Do you know what year it was?
2007, but it only had like 35,000 miles on it. And I had no problems with it, but as soon as I sold it, they did.
But that's something that he normally does, is he
Yes,
will
ma'am.
take cars and sell them to his friends, right?
Correct.
Does he also involve himself? He's a dentist, right? That's not his only source of income though, right?
No, ma'am.
He has other business ventures and other things going on.
Yes, ma'am. We were in business together, and then he owns like Class C rental properties.
Oh, properties that he rents out to tenants and stuff?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And he has a house in Fort Lauderdale, right?
Correct.
Is it a mansion?
Not at all.
Okay. In comparison to some of the other houses in South Florida, how would you describe it? Moderate?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. It was. I don't know. It was kind of gross.
But he's still that guy that has a Ferrari parked in his garage, right?
Correct.
All right, may I have a brief moment?
Yes.
I have no further questions, Judge. Thank you.
Cross-examination?
What was your understanding of how Catherine McVanwell came to own the Lexus?
That it was sold to her for a reduced rate, or I don't know the price or what the terms were.
You were given a deposition in this case, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'm going to turn your attention to page 55, lines 18 through 21.
Yes, I said he gave it to her. I don't know, gave it to her a reduced rate. I don't know what a reduced rate is, you know? It
Okay.
could be 50
So-
bucks or something.
You don't have any personal knowledge of their bank accounts. You didn't see any check or
No,
cash
ma'am.
exchange. Okay. You said in your deposition that you thought that he gave it to her, but he may have given it to her at a reduced rate.
Possibly, yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about this confrontation. This confrontation that you're talking about, that this is what Charlie Adelson told you, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And he told you that Garcia confronted he and Catherine McBanwell when they were together, right?
Correct.
Okay. And this confrontation occurred during the day
From my understanding, yes.
when I need to say who, when Charlie Adelson and Catherine McBanwell were planning to go jet skiing that day.
From my understanding, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And Charlie Adelson had his jet skis with him. That's what they were planning to go do.
From what I understood, from what Charlie said, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And that's when Garcia confronted them, tried to run them off the road.
Correct.
Okay. Made a scene.
From my understanding of what I was told, yes, ma'am.
And Catherine McBanwell was there.
From my understanding from what I was told, yes, ma'am.
Right.
Okay.
You weren't
Okay.
there.
No, ma'am.
This is just what Charlie's telling you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you said that he didn't tell you about any other confrontation that he ever had with Garcia besides that jet ski incident.
No, ma'am.
Okay. And you don't have any knowledge of any communication between Charlie and Garcia besides him saying that, hey, he confronted me when we were taking the jet skis out.
Correct.
Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Redirect.
Mr. Fitzpatrick, you described Charles Adelson as brilliant, right?
Correct.
He wouldn't be the type of person to plan a homicide on a regular phone that could be tracked, right?
I would hope not.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. You're free to go.
Please.